going to count me down?
Yeah, I'll just say whenever you're ready.
Okay.
You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Welcome to my research presentation. My name is Anna, and today I'll be talking to you about the role of consumers, specifically consumer understanding of fast fashion supply and demand. Fast fashion is a very popular way of designing, manufacturing, and purchasing clothing. In simple terms, fast fashion products are created on the premise that they are not made to last long, making consumers buy more and more, but at the expense of the environment. The research question I've been working to answer is, how does consumers' understanding of fast fashion supply and demand cycle impact their shopping habits? Before I dive into my research, I'll provide a little background information on how I got to supply and demand. First, I personally undergone a new shopping habit this past year, opting for more sustainable and reusable alternatives rather than fast fashion stores. As I was looking at previous studies related to fast fashion, I noticed that there was a gap in research regarding the supply and demand factor in their industry, which is arguably one of the most important aspects of their business. Along with this, studying consumers' understanding of supply and demand would provide a new perspective when measuring their self-awareness. As I was looking at previous studies, as I mentioned earlier, I was able to identify 3 main concepts that consistently reoccurred through all the works I've looked through. Those 3 being consumer attitude, ecological conscience, and social media marketing influence. In fast fashion, consumer attitude generally revolves around a need for aesthetics, to keep up with fashion trends, and follow the post-capitalist influence of consumerism. Ecological conscience was also a widely discussed topic, as there seemed to be an attitude-behavior gap between consumers' concern for the environment and their actual behaviors that contribute to environmental issues. Along with these 2, social media marketing influence has had a major impact on both consumer attitude and ecological conscience by providing constant sales, trends, and deals for us to keep up with. Social media marketing influence has completely changed the way people shop. With each concept that I took notice of, I also cited a paper that was highly relevant to that field of research. For consumer attitude, I took notice of Dong Shen's work. This study inquired consumers' understanding of sustainable fashion, and as observed from the results, there appeared to be the attitude-behavior gap that I mentioned earlier. While the majority of participants demonstrated an understanding of sustainable fashion and its environmentally conscious production, they remained under the assumption that there is very limited affordable sustainable clothing. In general, the study demonstrated that while most consumers recognize that environmental welfare is an issue in fast fashion, price sensitivity simply takes priority. The second paper I took notice of is moral disengagement and the motivational gap in climate change. There are 2 theories suggested in this paper. 1, that our moral judgment systems are simply not fully capable of comprehending complex global issues such as climate change, and 2, that we are unwilling to abide by our moral judgment systems due to a consumer culture that we conform to and live by. Both of these theories work hand in hand together, and both lead to a dissociation of our internal guilt, hence the motivational gap. Conformity plays a large role in these 2 theories. As quoted by Walter Peters, invoking the usualness of greenhouse gas emitting activities would render each greenhouse gas emitting activity self-excusing, if and merely because it is sufficiently common. A large portion of the fast fashion industry relies on marketing, which in the past decade has quickly taken over most, if not all, social media platforms. This article from the Journal of Economic Issues cites plant emulsions as one of the most important cornerstones of the fast fashion industry. Both of these aspects combined has allowed the industry to create fashion seasons, due to the short life cycle of fast fashion clothing and our increasing demand for aesthetics. As quoted by Ahmad F. Oran, traditional marketing is based on need. You take a product that corresponds to an existing demand. But fashion is based on creating a need where in reality there is none. Fashion is a factory that shapes and manufactures desire. The excessive social media marketing that consumers are exposed to daily only reinforces this desire for clothing. Lastly, I wanted to include a seminal study conducted by Gerard Casham from the University of Pennsylvania. This study observed various clothing production systems, most commonly used, the quick response system, enhanced design system, and a third system that uses a combination of both techniques. But most commonly used by fast fashion brands, the quick response system, which is divided into the pre-selling season and the selling season. One of the most important aspects of this schedule is the sales season that occurs right before they restart the pre-selling season. These sales seasons highly stimulate mass consumption from consumers, usually offered during holidays all throughout the year. Whether it's Christmas, Valentine's Day, or 4th of July, these sales occur for nearly any special occasion. This specific production system is meant to reinforce the notion that our clothing is not made to last, and therefore plays into new arising fashion trends for us to follow. Overall, some general conclusions I took away from these sources and other scholarly works I looked through is 1, that our post-capitalist culture has been highly influential in the rise of materialism. 2, that the majority of study participants were able to recognize the environmental sacrifice behind an industry as substantial as fast fashion. And 3, that despite this acknowledgement, price sensitivity ultimately takes priority due to increasingly expensive living costs. These conclusions then led me to my hypothesis that in my conducted research, those who identify as individual contributors to environmental issues and demonstrate an understanding of supply and demand will then opt for more sustainable alternatives rather than fast fashion stores. For my research, I decided a correlational survey would be most effective to gather my data. Through this survey, I'll be collecting quantitative and qualitative data, and I'll be able to use different types of questions such as multiple choice, short answer, ranking scale, and true or false questions. Through this survey, I'll be collecting data on my participants' values, behaviors, and knowledge, all of which are essential to answer my research question. My first step in research was to create and organize my survey questions. I decided to split my survey into 4 sections: demographics, shopping habits, fast fashion understanding, and my supply and demand evaluation. The shopping habits section serves to inquire frequency, location, and preferences when shopping, such as specific stores they shop at and whether they shop in person or online. The understanding of fast fashion section inquires what my participants understand about fast fashion and its relation to environmental welfare. And most important part of my research process was creating my supply and demand evaluation. For this section, I decided to ask 4 true or false questions about the general concept of supply and demand. After receiving my responses, I then individually scored each response, with those who scored 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 4, demonstrating an adequate understanding of supply and demand. After creating my survey, I then distributed it through various teachers at my school. While voluntary participating students are random, I intentionally selected certain teachers in order to gather an equal amount of data from each grade level. These teachers then offered my survey to their students during class, roughly taking about 10 minutes to complete the survey. My last step in research was to collect and analyze my data. First, I made sure that my demographic section was representative of all grade levels at my school. I then used Google spreadsheets to calculate correlation coefficients and find relationships between variables throughout my survey. I took away some important statistics from my results. The first being that about 52% of participants considered themselves individual contributors to environmental issues. For this question, I asked through a ranking scale to what extent they agree that they themselves as individuals contribute to environmental issues, with 4 and 5 being agree and strongly agree. 3 was considered neutral for all my ranking scale questions, so those who selected 3 are not included in this statistic. My second statistic is that about 72% of participants scored at least a 3 or higher on the supply and demand evaluation. The rest either scored a 1 or 2, but none of the participants missed all the questions. In comparison to my question asking if they consider themselves individual contributors to environmental issues, I also asked if they considered fast fashion a contributor. As you can see, the majority selected 3 and 4, either a neutral or simply agree. However, whether they strongly agreed between the 2 varied, with 45 participants selecting 5 for fast fashion and only 20 selected 5 for themselves. As I calculated my data, I found the following components especially essential to answering my research question. Firstly, I compared my individual contributor question to their supply and demand scores. The correlation coefficient between these 2 questions ended up being 0.01. so essentially no correlation, meaning that those who demonstrated an adequate understanding of supply and demand didn't necessarily consider themselves individual contributors to environmental issues. Secondly, I compared the supply and demand scores to their likelihood of shopping sustainably if given more accessibility in terms of location and affordability. The correlation coefficient calculated to 0.06, meaning that those who demonstrated an adequate understanding of supply and demand still wouldn't opt for sustainable alternatives even when given more opportunity. Next, I compared my individual contributor question to another ranking scale question asking them to rank how important a consumer's role is in the fast fashion's clothing production. The correlation coefficient calculated to 0.39, indicating a positive correlation, meaning that those who considered themselves individual contributors also tended to consider the importance of a consumer's role in fast fashion production as important or very important. And most importantly, I compared their supply and demand scores to their actual shopping habits. All the participants either scored a 1, 2, 3, or 4 on their supply and demand evaluation. And for their shopping habits, I organized them into 3 categories. 1, those who reported primarily shopping sustainably, typically through secondhand clothing stores or sustainable clothing lines. 2, those who reported primarily shopping from fast fashion stores. And 3, those who reported shopping from a mix of both fast fashion stores and sustainable alternatives. For these categories, I numerically coded my data in order to calculate the coefficient, which ended up being 0.001. So essentially no correlation between the 2 variables. In general, the participants' understanding of supply and demand had little to no correlation in the variables I compared them to, especially in their actual shopping habits. As other surrounding literature had predicted in this field of research, price sensitivity played a very important role for consumers' shopping habits. I noticed that 61% of those who reported paying for their own clothes considered affordability either important or very important. In contrast, 40% of those who pay for their own clothes considered eco-friendly products important or very important when shopping. So the individual who's actually purchasing the clothing seemed to impact the participants' priorities. Lastly, the strongest correlation I found in my data was between those who considered fast fashion versus themselves contributors to environmental issues. The correlation coefficient calculated to 0.46, meaning that the majority of those who considered fast fashion a contributor to environmental issues also considered themselves individual contributors. Of course, there are always limitations when conducting research, and a significant limitation to my research was self-reported bias among my participants. Because this is a self-reported, unmonitored essay, this left opportunity for participants to simply click through answers and guess on the supply and demand evaluation. Due to time constraints for the students and myself as a researcher, there was also simply a lack of detail in my questions. Specifically, in my questions inquiring their understanding and familiarity with fast fashion and sustainability. These were simply yes, no, or somewhat questions. They understood these 2 concepts, they somewhat understood the 2 concepts, or they did not understand the 2. These questions were left as multiple choice, but a short answer option would have allowed for more insight and detail. The supply and demand evaluation was also left very short, once again due to time constraints. Because there are only 4 true or false questions, it cannot be assumed that the reported scores demonstrate an accurate depiction of what the participants understand about supply and demand. This section also would have been an opportunity for the participants to simply guess on the questions as I had mentioned earlier. Lastly, participants may interpret questions differently than I intended. Most commonly, many who reported shopping sustainably did not necessarily consider themselves contributors to environmental issues, while several who reported shopping from fast fashion stores actually did consider themselves individual contributors. This misinterpretation is likely due to the fact that those who tried to shop sustainably exempt themselves as contributors, though they are able to recognize why opting for fast fashion would make themselves contributors. As for implications in my research, it has been shown through my data that understanding supply and demand played essentially no role in consumers' shopping habits. However, the acknowledgement of fast fashion as a contributor to environmental issues played a stronger role in whether or not they considered themselves contributors. The data gathered from my research can help us understand the extent of high school students' ecological conscience and whether they apply it to their actions or not. Further research in this field will provide new insights on high school students' discernment of complex global issues and particularly inquire about fast fashion supply and demand cycle. By doing so, there will be new data on younger generations' ability to grasp their individual roles in supply and demand, specifically in the fashion industry. This concludes my presentation, and these are my references.
In the 5 minutes that we have left, we have 3 questions for you. Your first question is, how did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
So because I decided to use a correlational survey, this set me up for my limitations, which was mainly self-reported bias. However, this limitation is quite common and can be found in most survey methods of research. By doing my one single survey, I was able to collect data on my participants' ecological conscience, their shopping habits, and evaluate their supply and demand, all of which are essential aspects to answering my research question. Doing this through one survey allowed me to collect and analyze my data in a timely manner for the class rather than rushing through the analysis.
And our second question?
How does your new understanding address a gap in scholarly conversation?
A significant gap in this field of research is the relation of consumers' understanding of supply and demand to their behaviors. Other scholarly works usually acknowledge consumers' ecological conscience and their knowledge of the harm of fast fashion, but there wasn't any mention of supply and demand and their acknowledgement of their contribution to this cycle. Because my data indicated that understanding supply and demand played very little role in consumer shopping habits, this addresses the gap in whether or not consumers' understanding of supply and demand impacts the way they shop.
And our last question?
If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
So the most important thing I would change about my survey is my supply and demand evaluation. I think that asking about the general concept of supply and demand doesn't necessarily correlate to the participants' comprehension of their role as the demand for fast fashion. Instead, I would ask more multiple choice questions about specifically fast fashion supply and demand cycle. That way the questions will be directly related to the relationship between the fast fashion industry and supply and demand. I believe that the responses from these specified questions would then likely reinforce my original hypothesis that those who identify as individual contributors to environmental issues and demonstrate an adequate understanding of fast fashion supply and demand cycle will then opt for more sustainable shopping alternatives.